The new page of our colors example is where the fun will really begin as we're converting things over to using our color class, converting things over to working in a more object-oriented way. While our index and our show pages were fine, they were both relatively easy because the actual contact between those two pages and the actual color data itself was fairly minimal. On the index page, all we had to do was load all the colors. On the show page, all we had to do was load one color. Other than that, we weren't doing anything but displaying the colors themselves. The new page has to have access to the colors that already exist for the purpose of being able to do things like determine what the next available ID will be. It'll also, of course, need to be able to store new color data. So there's a lot more contact, much more intimate contact between what's going on our new page and the actual color data itself. So it should be a lot more interesting converting it over to use our color class. For starters, if I take a look in my browser at the new page, it of course does not at all function right now, primarily because I've wiped out my color library file. I think what we might do here with the new page is take a couple of passes through it. On the first pass, let's just see if we can get the new page to start working again using the color objects basically the way we have them right now. And then on a second pass, we'll shoot for something that'll be a little bit more ideal. So let's start by zooming through my new page here. For starters, I don't need the color library file anymore. What I'm going to need instead is my color class, which is in the color.php file. So I'll switch that over. The next place where I see that we are specifically using something that was from that file is here. When the form has been submitted, when we've validated our fields, when we've found that we have no errors, what we did right here was we were then loading all of our colors. We were doing that so that we could then determine what the next available ID was going to be. Since I don't have my load color function anymore, let me switch that over to color all. So again, we get all of our colors loaded in, but now this colors array that previously contained subarrays will now contain objects, so we'll have to take that into account as we work with it. Where we're working with that is here in this for each loop. We're going through that array of colors, taking each thing out as color. Previously, color here was a subarray, but now it will be an object. So instead of accessing it as it was an array, I'll need to switch over to using the object type notation. So if the ID of the color we're looking at is greater than our last ID variable's value, then we want to take that ID value and make that the last ID value. As that goes through, we should end up with last ID being the largest ID number that's available. Next thing we had in here was we were opening our file name variable. We still have that here in this file, do we not? Here it is. Okay. So that's still right there where it was. That should continue to work. Once we have the file actually opened, we then are taking all of the values the user submitted from the form, we're putting them into an associative array, including that new ID number. We then write that using our color as string function. Now there's another little problem. We've gotten rid of that function. Why don't we take our new color here, which is an associative array, just like we need it to be. The only little difference being that I'm not calling color name anymore. Now I'm just calling it name. We could take that array and we could use that to actually create a new color object. So what if I say new color is a new color? And then I will pass that associative array to the constructor. So the associative array gets passed over to the constructor. The constructor then will create a new color object for us called new color. Then when we get to the fwrite, we can just call new color. When we put new color here all by itself, PHP will know that it needs that color as a string. So it should automatically call the toString method that we put together for our color, which effectively did the same thing as what that color to string function that I just got rid of did. Assuming that works, we then close up our file, redirect the user to the show page for that particular color, and hopefully everything else there will work out pretty all right. As far as the actual view itself goes, when I render my template, that's going to pull up my new.view.php page. At a glance, I don't see anything here that's going to change as a result of my new object. Over on the form itself, we're calling our text field function numerous times. I believe all of these variables still exist, so I don't think any of that will change. The text field function itself, I think, will still be the same as it was before as well. So let's take a look at that in the browser and see what's still broken. My new page now, if I hit refresh, the page shows up as it should. If I try to save a new color, looks like validation is working okay. There we have 3 invalid fields and 1 valid field. If I go ahead and finish off this color and tell it to create it, it looks like it created just fine. So at this point we're back to having a working color, a working new page I should probably say. We're back to having a working new page again. So where does that then leave us? Well, could we just call it finished at this point? Sure, I suppose we could. Nobody's making us do any of this stuff. We could just say that's good enough if we wanted to. But the whole point in getting into this object-oriented stuff in the first place was to try to make our lives easier in the future. To make our code more reusable was the basic reason for this object-oriented business. Have we done that? Have we made our lives easier? Well, let's think about it from this point of view. What if tomorrow I decide that color data is no longer going to be stored in a text file, instead it's going to be stored in a database? What am I going to have to do? Well, I'm going to have to, of course, change my color class. Things like the all and the find function will of course have to be updated, but I'm also then going to have to change my new page, because my new page is still doing a lot of things very directly with the file. We're still opening a file, we're still writing the color to the file. Ideally, what would happen here is that if I did change something about colors, like adding a new attribute or changing the way that they're stored, those changes should primarily or only have to take place in the color class itself, and I have not actually accomplished that with the changes that I've made so far on the new page. I would really, on my new page, like to go much further to minimizing the contact between the details of how a color is stored, retrieved, worked with, and the actual workings of the new page itself. So there's actually still, I would say ideally, a lot more work here that needs to be done. Part of the trick to this entire thing is figuring out just how far to go with it and what order to put it in so that I don't just completely destroy it and leave us with too much work to do without being able to at least test as we actually go through. What if we started off here on our new page by seeing if we could much more quickly get data into the color objects themselves rather than working with them in these individual standalone variables the way that we have been? What if I, for example, get rid of all these standalone variables which are starting off initially as blanks, and what if I replace them instead with a blank color object? We had set up our constructor so that we should be able to create a color object that has nothing in it but default values. That constructor check to see if no data is passed to it, and if no data is passed it assumes null, and then it just doesn't go through and really do much of anything in the constructor at all. So we should start off with a color that just has our default attributes, 0 for an ID and blank for basically all the other values. If I were to do that, then that's already pretty drastically going to change how most everything works. In a way, my new page here sort of works in a couple of different modes. Everything outside this if statement is basically what happens if the page is being accessed without the form having been submitted. So sort of a first visit to the page essentially is what we're talking about here if we're outside the if statement. Just making that one little change, getting rid of those variables, and instead using a blank color object. Let's see how our page works with that little change, not even trying to submit the page. If I go back to my browser and go to the new page, it actually seems like at that point it's pulling up pretty okay, which is a little bit of a surprise, but so far it's actually okay. What is actually happening there? What's actually happening is if I'm not submitting, then I'm not running any of the code inside that big if statement. Instead, our view page is really not doing much of anything other than loading the form. The form itself is just calling the text field function. The text field function you'll see here is still trying to use that group of variables that I erased. Since those variables have never been used anywhere, they're essentially just blank, which means when that function actually runs and puts together the fields, it's filling the fields as if they're blank, which is more or less what it should be doing here on a first try. Even though it's not causing any errors, it's really not technically correct. I don't really want my form to be making up variables and just always filling in blank. I would want it in this point to be using the values that are actually coming from the color object. So what if I went ahead and changed the way that my text field function works so that it uses the color object instead for the source of the values for those fields, instead of using a bunch of essentially make-believe variables at that point? If I make that little change and pass the color as the second argument, in the function itself, the color is this thing right here. Instead of calling that value, maybe I'll refer to that just generically as object. In that function then, we're taking the name that was passed, we're using that to generate a nice name, which we then use for the label. That doesn't really change. So far, nothing is really changing with the way we're handling errors. The name, the nice name, that stuff is all the same. What's different right now is the value right here. We don't have a value anymore. Now instead what we have is we have this object that's being passed. Now the object itself isn't a value, it's actually a collection of values. The object that's being passed, the color object, actually has stored inside of it a name, a red value, a green value, a blue value, and I don't want to put all of them here into this text field. This text field is for one individual attribute, and that's the attribute specified by name. So for example, the first text field up here should be representing the color name that's stored inside my color. Of course, I don't call it color name anymore, do I? So I should probably change that to just name. The way I could actually handle that inside the function is when I go to the object, I could use my arrow notation and then I could use the name there. So in this case, I'm actually making the attribute name that I'm accessing from my object a variable. So if name is red value, let's say, then we'll be accessing the red value of whatever color was passed to this function. With that one little change made, then at that point this text field function should be properly using our objects. If I jump back over to my browser again and refresh, things seem to be okay. You notice the label there actually updated, so it's now named the way that it actually is inside the color object itself. So that's a good improvement. My page is pulling up and it is actually using the values from the object it's being given at this point. So because I'm giving it a blank object, the form itself is showing up blank. But that's an important step because hopefully now during validation, whenever we actually do have values in the object itself, hopefully those values will be showing up in the form properly. Let's look at what happens then if the form actually does submit. If the form actually does submit, then this if statement should be true, or at least it should be if I make this name field name as it is actually being used now. A little bit of a change there. What we were doing next then was we were extracting all the values for the new color from the post array, and we were putting them into those variables that we had before. Those variables are gone now. What I want to do now is I want to take the values that were submitted from the post array, and I instead want to use them to create a new color object. Since we set up our color objects constructor to be able to take an associative array, I can just pass the post array directly to it because the post array is an associative array. So that should do the trick. So now whenever I submit my form, the values that are submitted will be used to create a new color object. That color object will replace the color object that was created up here. So if the form isn't submitted, we have a blank color object that we just use for the remainder of the script. If the form was submitted, then we replace the blank color object with a color object that actually has the values in it that the user supplied in the form. Once we've done that, validation then can actually use the values from that object. So instead of a color name variable here, what we would have is the name attribute of the color object. Red value would be an attribute of the color object, as would the green and the blue values. There we are. When we come down and check our errors, that part hasn't changed yet. I suppose at that point the thing that would be then different would be that when we get down to actually save, we probably don't need to generate a new color object at that point. We already have a color object that has those values in it, so we ought to be able to just get rid of that line altogether and just use the color object that we already have. Maybe something like this. With that change made, let's take a glance through some of the other files. On the new page, don't see anything in particular there that again needs to change. We've already made an update to our form. So let's give it a try and see if it works this way. A little bit closer to being object oriented than it was a minute ago. My new page still looks like it pulls up okay. Validation is almost still working, except our name field isn't validating. Why is that? On the name field, it looks like I forgot to switch over from using color name to using just name. So let me change that in my validate function. Now the name field is validating correctly. Can we actually create a color? I thought I put in B's. Why did it show up with all E's? I'm not sure if that actually worked or not. Let me give it another try. Go to the new page. I'm going to make a color called blah. I'll set the values to all F's. And it's taking me over to the wrong one. It looks like something there's not working. ID 21 is where it actually seemed to take me. ID 21 seems to be a color that already exists. If I go to create another new color, 21 is where I'm still going. So it looks like somehow we might be failing in creating our new ID. Let's take a look and see if we can figure out why that is. Here, if we have no errors, we load all of our colors. Last ID starts at 0, going through each one of those colors, taking each one as color. I wonder if we're getting a bit of a name conflict here. I already have a color variable here, and now I'm trying to use another color variable. That seems like that might be kind of a bad idea. Maybe here in the for each loop, instead of using color, what if I used color for ID as the name of it? I'll change it inside that little loop everywhere it's being used. Let's see if that makes any difference. If I again go to my new page, try to create another new color, sent me straight back to my index page that time. Looks like it got a little bit closer. What is this color that was created? ID blah. Looks like our ID is not getting assigned properly. Oh, here's a little mistake. I got double dollar signs in there. Let's fix that and see if that makes a difference. Let me destroy that particular color. Oh yeah, our destroy page isn't going to work right now, so that's not going to happen. Let me just go straight back to the index page. Here we are. Let's try creating another new color again. I'll call this one blah 2. No, still, that doesn't seem to have fixed it, so that double dollar sign didn't seem to be causing the problem. What else could it be? The fundamental problem we seem to be having has to do with the ID. When the ID actually gets written, it's being written here in this fWrite statement. In this fWrite statement, we're using the toString function of our color object. And the toString function of our color object, if we take a look, writes out the ID that's actually stored in the object itself. Are we ever actually taking the last ID that we figure out and using it, putting it in, saving it in, the new color? I don't think we actually are. Maybe what we need to do is here sometime before we actually go to save the file, we should take our color that we're actually trying to save, and we should set its ID to a pre-incremented version of the last ID, something I think we were doing before when we were generating the color string to put into the file manually. Here I'm going to take that ID, I'm going to create it, and I'm going to stick it into the object itself, so that when the object then turns itself into a string down here in the fWrite, hopefully the correct ID will be stored. Let's see what that does. Back here on my index page in the browser, I've actually gone to my text file and I've wiped out some of those sample records that I was trying to create, those sample colors, just to clean things up again. Now if I go and try and create another new color, I'm going to go back to trying to create blah again. There we go. Blah is being created correctly now, ID 22. So now it looks like it's working correctly. Maybe I'll give it one more try. Let's just try creating a regular old blue. Yeah, that seems to be working just fine. So now we've got our new page again back into a working state using the color objects a bit more deeply than it was on our last try. So we're getting closer and closer all the time.